Good afternoon, everyone, and you're very welcome to our webinar this afternoon, Leading Innovation in a Changing World. And I'd like to welcome alumni and friends from around the world to this special event. So the event is being recorded, and we will send details of the link to the event after the event has taken place. So this is the latest in a number of events that the Development and Alumni Relations Office has undertaken with our colleagues in Ulster University Business School. So the Business School has over 6,000 students and 140 staff, and the impact of the research conducted by the school was rated 7th out of 101 business schools in the last Research Excellence Framework Assessment of Research at UK universities. We have guests today registered from all around the world. We have people from Australia, Canada, the Cayman Islands, Egypt, England, Germany, Greece, Italy, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Scotland, Singapore, Spain, the USA, Wales, and Ireland, North and South. So everyone's very, very welcome. There have been a number of significant events at the university over this past number of months and since we last had a conversation. And chief amongst those have been the opening of Ulster University's first School of Medicine, and we welcomed the first cohort of students to that within the last number of months. We also have welcomed our first students to our new Belfast campus, and that's where a number of business studies students are currently in attendance. We had a very significant research grant awarded to the university and partners last week for the teaching of mathematics, and that's over £8 million worth, and it is going to be based and led out of the Korean campus. And finally, just last week, a number of university researchers and former students were part of the Array Collective, which won the Turner Prize. So 7 of our current and past students and researchers were members of that team, and that's a very significant prize in the arts world. I would like to take this opportunity to thank people for their support over the past number of months. It's been particularly trying, I think, for everyone, and we've had an awful lot of support for our students and our efforts at continuing with their education and giving them an excellent education. And we look forward to continue to engage with you. I'd like now to introduce one of our most esteemed alumni. Grainne McNamara graduated from Ulster University's Business School in 1994, and she has almost 3 decades of global experience in investment banking and consulting. Grainne currently assists EY's clients with major change initiatives with a focus on digital transformation, agile organizations, and culture as a driver of long-term value. Grainne is active in social justice and gender equality and chairs the board of the New York Women's Foundation. She is an adjunct professor at Fordham University, where she writes and teaches about managing change from a strategy perspective. Grainne has been a great supporter of the university, and events such as this illustrate our support. We're delighted to have Grainne with us, and we look forward to hearing from her. So I'm going to pass you over now to Grainne for the main event.
Thank you so much, Eddie, and thank you to Ulster University for such a warm welcome. I'm just absolutely delighted to be here today, and it's so fantastic to hear people all over the world tuning in. Thank you for taking this time to have this conversation about managing innovation and change. I'm just going to share my screen so I could share a couple of visuals with you as we go through the conversation. And what I want to cover today really is, it's no surprise to anybody that we're in a period of unprecedented change. I want to talk about the strategy that many of our clients have around innovation and disruption and transformation. And so just to set the scene and kick us off, I want to share with you some statistics. They're from a video that I was going to play, but I decided to just show them as slides here from Jose Estevez, and just giving us a sense of the massive amount of disruption that's part of our lives today. First of all, obviously, the number of people in the world significantly growing. The people that are born today are born into an algorithm economy. They are digital native. The 25% of the population in China with the highest IQ is larger than the total population of North America. So we see a significant shift, obviously, in where innovation is coming from in the world. For the first time in history, and this won't be lost on many of us on the call, we have 5 generations working side by side in the workforce, and they speak to each other in different ways. And so adaptive leadership and the ability to communicate becoming more and more nuanced. So the digital revolution is really just getting started, even though it feels like to many of us that we've been living in this period of change for quite some time. 35 billion devices connected to the Internet of Things. We'll talk about that and some of the opportunities that presents. 400 new websites are created every minute. A massive amount of online communication. As you can see, we're all fans of WhatsApp, definitely, I'm sure, on this call, those of us that live overseas, and certainly I use it to communicate with family. The amount of people on Google, the amount of people connected to the Internet, there are only 8 billion people in the world, and yet there are 7 billion Google searches on a daily basis. The amount of self-curated content that people are sharing, the ability to share your own and create your own content through platforms such as YouTube, the ability for people to get their voices out there. The ability to monetize platforms, we'll talk about that a little bit. It's been fascinating to me to see how much my son plays on Fortnite. Fortnite, although it's free to play, has $2 billion in revenue. Instagram, which is the Facebook for young people, as my children told me. I do use Instagram somewhat, but it has, again, 1 billion users in a world of 8 billion people. And of course, there's the rise of quantum computing. IBM just unveiled one of the first commercial quantum computers, so we are about to enter, again, an unprecedented uptick in the ability of technology to transform the world that we live in. Massive amounts of data being produced. Again, 90% of the world's data has been created in the last couple of years. What are we doing with big data? What insights can we draw from that data? Displacement of jobs and workers. 50% of work activities are technically now automatable. We'll talk a little bit about the impact of the pandemic on the workforce and workforce transformation associated with that. And the predictions are that artificial intelligence will outperform humans in many activities over the next 10 years. And so the question is, what do humans do when the machines do a lot of things that we do today? How do we harness creativity and innovation? We'll talk a little bit about that, and creating cultures around learning and innovation and curiosity and things that the computers can't yet do. So very meaningful, I guess, for all the students that are out there today is that anybody starting a 4-year technical degree now, it means that half of what they learn in the first year of study will be outdated by their 3rd year of study. So the most important thing that we can teach our students is how to manage change, which is exactly what we're talking about today. The top 10 in-demand jobs today did not exist 10 years ago. So the things certainly that I went to college for and learned are not the things that people are doing today. We're currently preparing students for jobs that don't yet exist. I hear a lot of my colleagues telling me that their children are not applying for jobs, they're creating their own futures through startups and leveraging technology and other things. So how do we prepare our students for entering into a world that's transforming so dramatically using technologies that have not yet been invented? The advent of quantum will significantly change the accessibility of much of this technology in order to solve problems that we don't even know are problems yet. For example, I was thinking to myself, when space travel is a thing, will we be able to check baggage? I mean, I'm kidding, but lots and lots and lots of new technologies that mean new questions. So what are leading organizations doing? And these are the things that I'm going to spend the next several moments talking to you about. And that is thinking about transformation differently. Thinking about innovation at scale. You might call that continuous transformation. We'll look at what does a successful innovation platform look like inside a corporate entity. What are some of the elements of success there? Technology at speed. I just gave you a sense of how quickly things are moving. Certainly, people talk about the 4th industrial revolution powered by cloud and powered by multi-platform technologies, multi-tenant platforms that transcend some of the technology that we have today. We'll talk a little bit about that and how corporates are using that to change the business models. And then I want to end on really focusing on humans at the center, because again, I think this is a critical differentiator. If the pandemic has really taught us anything, it is the value of the human in the process, and how to create long-term value, corporates really need to think about the culture and the community and the affinity that they're creating around the people that work for the organization. So how do you deal with all of this change? Well, first we need a strategy, and even what is strategy, I would say, is shifting. in the light of all of the transformation that's happening in the world. We do need a strategy. Obviously, rowing in the wrong direction isn't helpful, but even strategy itself is sort of up for grabs as a discipline in the sense that it now needs to be quite iterative. The strategy needs to be somewhat agile because the world, again, is changing so dramatically, and part of the job of leadership is to really figure out how to set a strategy but also be responsive and agile as the world is changing around us. Narrowing that cone of uncertainty is critical, so we have strategies and tactics that we use to talk about future-back planning, which allows us to sort of cast our minds into the future, figure out what the art of the possible might be, what sorts of things are on the horizon, and then plan back. How do we work back from that? How do we remove some of the uncertainty so that we can have forward momentum? Because clearly, we need to execute, even though we know that the world is moving. Like I mentioned, plans do need to be agile. As we know, everybody has a plan until the first punch, as Muhammad Ali famously said. And so what do you do when that first knock happens? What do you do when failure is inevitable? How do you manage failure? We'll talk a little bit about culture around innovation and the importance of building in the notion that failure is part of the learning process. How do you create organizations that are learning and on a continuous basis? What are some of the cultural elements that go into that, so people feel that the culture is one where they are allowed to experiment and innovate? Success is relative. Again, we cannot let the great be the enemy of the good. We'll talk a little bit about iterative product development and agile technology strategies that allow people to iterate on what value looks like and to bring products to market and go to market in a more expedient manner. So businesses, when they're formulating strategy now, need to think about ways to play and what their right is to win based on who they are in the world. And what I would say is that there is a dramatic broadening of the stakeholder set that are now of concern to business leadership as they look to do this. So huge shift in what I'll call the social contract that happened during the pandemic. We'll talk a little bit about that. Some shifting of power to the employees in the mix, and certainly some shifting of accountability and responsibility back to the corporate world in terms of thinking about not just how they show up in the world, but how they create long-term value and what purpose the corporate entity actually represents. So I've listed some of the strategic questions that we work through with our clients on the page. These will be familiar to many of you, but I would say, again, an increasing amount of focus on number 8, perhaps, where do you show up in a interconnected ecosystem that is digital? How do you create value in that process? How do you create affinity with customer? How do you create long-term value propositions for clients? And how do you monetize assets in digital ecosystems? How do you show up? What is the value that you're creating based on your historical position in that ecosystem, or based on a defensive or offensive strategy that you might be employing because of the emergence of some technology that you can now use? So let's talk for a moment about innovation as a discipline, innovation as an intentional part of the strategy, to have an outside-in perspective as well as an inside-out perspective. So many of our clients are looking to leverage emerging technologies, leverage what's happening in fintech and other ecosystems where people are delivering new technologies very rapidly. And of course, one of the challenges is, how do you take that technology out of the lab? It's a great idea. How do you take it out of the lab and monetize it and make it a commercial viable proposition? And so some of the things and the elements that need to go into that is, again, a culture of continuous transformation. Transformation is not just something that happens in a sort of a linear manner. It needs to be embedded. And so, again, that the embedding of the notion of a learning organization and the ability to be agile and to have a process to anticipate the future, to look into the future, and as we said before, to narrow that cone of uncertainty, to develop hypotheses about where things are going, and then to make some bets, to make some investments around that, like a venture capital might be doing. We work with a lot of large corporates who have their own CVC, corporate venture capital arms, and they do not only strategic investments where they're looking to be part of the R&D process for things that are adjacent to their business functions. So they'll make investments to learn, just like a venture capital might. and they'll have a point of view on whether or not this piece of technology is accretive to their business models, and they'll express that through their venture capital arms. So again, understanding how to unlock some of that investment is important as we think about which pieces of innovation are we likely to take out of the lab and into the prime time. This notion of developing MVPs, minimum viable products, again, minimum viable concepts sort of comes before that. Which are the concepts that make it through the ideation process into the funding process, and which are the things that we're actually looking to spend money on in the labs, and how do we do that? These labs that our customers are setting up, our clients are setting up, sometimes are outside the corporate enterprise, and they're participating in a collaborative manner with other entities, and sometimes they're internal, where there's some proprietary technology that they're exploring, that they're again, looking to invest in, looking to take to a certain minimum viable product that could be launched into the marketplace and could have a beta set of users that could adopt it and give feedback, and then sort of bringing the customer on that journey with the innovation process itself. The culture of innovation, we talked a little bit about that. The most significant element there in the cultural transformation would be the one of failing fast and allowing folks to understand, again, that failure is part of the learning process, and that there will be some things that on the edit floor that don't make it through the process, and that's okay. Expert ecosystems, again, we work with our clients to figure out how do you stay connected. Again, a dramatic amount of change going on outside, a very significant blurring of the lines between, technology companies, for example, and banks. How do you know who's even a competitor? How do you stay tuned to the competitive landscape? How do you understand the addressable market? And how do you understand adjacent innovation that's happening that could impact the business model? So there needs to be a methodology to take concepts and ideas, to refine them, and then frankly to be able to launch them into the world and look at the commercial viable proposition, and to have a feedback mechanism around that so that you can iterate and take that to scale. So just looking for a moment at technology transformation and the notion again that the pandemic has accelerated the speed at which corporates are absorbing technology and brought an urgency to the need for them to deploy collaborative and remote types of technology that connect people to the enterprise. And so, this term digital transformation obviously is thrown around a lot. So we try to break it down and say, what does it really mean? Well, it doesn't refer to any particular technology. It really refers to a confluence of technologies that together can be brought together to solve business problems. And so I spent a few years in the blockchain space. I'll talk about blockchain as a microcosm for companies looking at how to take a new technology and transform the business model because the technology is here. And so you might call that tech-led innovation as opposed to business-led innovation. And of course, the challenge there is that we need to make sure we're solving business problems. Just because the world can do it, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily desirable or that it's commercial to do so. So part of what we're trying to do as we look at developing a digital enterprise is we're trying to look at what is the strategy. Who am I? Who do I want to be in the future interconnected ecosystem, in cloud, in microservice technologies, and modern technologies that I could express different types of services in digital fashion. I could connect my ecosystem of clients or data into these and monetize those through digital native ecosystems. What is it that I'm trying to do? So I need to be successful, I need to connect my strategy of who I am in the world and the value that I bring to the infrastructure that I'm building. I need to have security, obviously, around that so that data is secure and that trust can be built within that ecosystem around the transformation that I'm doing. And I need to have customer experience that brings affinity from the set of customers that I'm interested in, and I need to be pretty nimble around that because, again, that is becoming increasingly more difficult to compete in the customer and user experience space. And then, of course, if I'm really in nirvana here, I'm doing something around data. I'm leveraging large data analytics. I'm building insights. I'm using the data in a way that brings new capability to the world. So I mentioned blockchain, and again, 4 years ago I would have been jumping on and off stages talking about blockchain as a sort of a game changer, and it had nothing to do with Bitcoin per se. It had to do with the notion that here on the scene was a technology that the goal of which really was to accelerate the ability for companies to get together and through networks that were trusted to share data and in such a way that they could eliminate some of the manual processing that existed around, in particular, the transfer of value. And so blockchain was, a distributed ledger technology that allowed, through cryptographically sealing the data in the ledger, it allowed the secure transfer of that data between different enterprises. And so we had spent a lot of years looking inside enterprises on, legacy modernization and the ability to upgrade the technology stack. And here now, we were talking about collaboration across enterprises, so extraprise, if you will, as opposed to enterprise, building of shared technology that could be built once, digital contracts that could be enabled once, and then shared across multiple parties in an ecosystem. So the promise of that was that you would take cost out, you would increase trust, you would connect, more intimately the members of that ecosystem, and that great value would come from that. I mentioned blockchain because part of what was happening in that ecosystem was exactly this, which is corporates were figuring out, what does strategy look like in a rapidly evolving, interconnected, multi-tenant world where I'm leveraging cloud, I'm leveraging data, and I'm building new types of digital native businesses. What is my strategy as I engage in that process? Not necessarily, what can blockchain do for me, but what is it that I'm really trying to do? And so we literally went into companies that said, I need to have a blockchain because everybody else has one, was sort of the mantra. Everybody has a blockchain project. And we sort of took a step back and said, okay, well, what can the blockchain do for the world? What is it that this strategy is that you're trying to express? Are you trying to disrupt? Are you trying to defend an existing incumbent position? Are you trying to write a new business model? Or are you trying to expand the existing business model? And where is the value proposition? Is it through the expression of digital identity and managing participants and data around participants in the network? Is it a digital currency like the Bitcoin scenario? Or are you trying to express in a digital fashion using digital twins or other sorts of devices? If I think about industrial product companies, are you trying to express supply chain and represent digitally assets that are existing in the physical world today in order to bring operational efficiency into those processes and to bring proximity into the supply chain? So many use cases emerged, and I guess the takeaway here for me was these the lens that was put on blockchain was a really good learning process to say, how might I take an emerging technology from the outside, consider the impact on my business strategy, consider whether that is an expansion moment, an offensive moment where I can take this technology and show up differently and create new value based on some of the assets that are, particular to where I sit in the ecosystem. Or is it a defensive play? In other words, in the case of financial services, there was some significant consideration given to the fact that we could eliminate some of the middlemen in the processing of financial securities, for example. And so what do I do about that in order to be relevant in the future? So I want to move for a second, having talked a little bit about the need to create an organizational culture that embraces innovation and the fact that there are a number of ways to participate in emerging technologies from a ecosystem perspective, and again that centers around strategy. I want to spend a few moments now talking about what I think the most important learning is that has come out of the pandemic, which is how do we think about workforce transformation and how do we handle humans in this very rapidly transformational world. And so I want to share with you some data around some work that EY did and also Microsoft did and Edelman did, and I'll share with you some of the statistics around what did the pandemic teach us as far as the humans in the process. And so, of course, you'll read in the media about the Great Recession, the Great Resignation, the Great Relocation, the dislocation effect that the pandemic had. And part of what I want to share here is that it's a moment for really a renaissance, a different way of showing up. And that one of the key themes here that I want to share is that adaptive leadership and transformational leadership becomes very pivotal in that process. So a couple of quick stats coming out of the research that I mentioned to you from EY and Edelman and Microsoft is that pre-COVID, only 5% of Americans worked 3 days, and apologies for the American reference, but that's where this data came from. But now 37% of Americans are working full-time from home, and 90% of Americans are expressing that they want more flexibility, but not a lot of corporates are showing up and saying what exactly that will look like. So we have this dislocation effect happening where people are looking to their employers to help them to figure out what hybrid looks like, but employers are either silent on the topic or they're not telling people what it is that people want to hear. The fact that employers look like they were out of touch during the pandemic. I know this was a huge fascination for leadership to be concerned about the well-being of employees. However, employees are saying that their companies expected too much. That leaders were much better off compared to staff, and that the people were not thriving. So we had a lot of conversation about burnout. I think that's still a reality. Employers are still really grappling with what are the wellness programs and the inclusion programs, and the types of resources that can now be given to this much larger role that employers are playing in terms of their employees' well-being. We know that Gen Z and women and frontline workers were struggling more, and so again, this potential dislocation effect for women, in particular women who had childcare and other responsibilities that were taking place here. And so again, we saw some women departing from the workforce because of that, and that's been documented. This idea that looking at productivity is a little illusory. Many companies were measuring, of course, productivity because they had to, because we were not proximate to each other. We were spread around different locations, and so productivity measures were very popular. And again, that would belie something else that's going on. Productivity measures were up by any standard. So this is data from Microsoft. People are spending 2.5 more time spent on Teams. Meeting length was up, 45% more chats. Number of documents that people were sharing was up. Number of calls people were on, we all felt that, are up, and people are responding much more timely. But underneath that, 1 in 5 people were saying that their employer doesn't care about their work-life balance. People are overwhelmed and exhausted, and Gen Z was disengaging fast. 60% of Gen Z saying that they were merely struggling, merely surviving, or flat out struggling. So this is very concerning for new folks that are arriving in the workforce. An important point on innovation. So again, this is something that companies really need to focus on. How are we really thinking about leveraging technology to ensure that we have collaborative, inclusive workplaces? If we look at the notion that some of what needs to happen from an innovation perspective is that we need these serendipitous, opportunistic interactions that happen, the water cooler moments that happen in the office, and that those are very difficult to recreate in the virtual environment. And so we see that playing out in the fact that people who were close became closer, and people who arguably we need to develop wider networks are having a bit of a struggle to do so. And of course, that's probably why Gen Z also feeling a little bit disconnected. They didn't have those strong, intimate networks in the company before we went into lockdown, and now they're struggling to connect in that remote environment. So this is going to be really important, I think, both in terms of culturally how that's addressed, but also technology, what technology we're leveraging to fix that. People are vulnerable. This is so funny. The language is changing in corporate America. I'm even surprised myself at some of the language that people are using. People cry with their colleagues. I've certainly experienced that with a number of colleagues who really struggled emotionally through this period of time. And people are open, I think, to all the events that happened in the world that caused us to have some affinity to each other around some bigger notions of social justice and equity and so on, racial justice. I think people are showing up wanting to bring their whole selves and looking for a safe space to do so. And again, it becomes very incumbent on organizations and companies to create that space and to model that sort of leadership that allows you to show up as who you are and belong. And so we see a shift even in the diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies to really be embracing this notion of belonging. How do we bring people into the organization and allow them to express their full selves, and how do we welcome that and incorporate that into the culture in a very intentional manner. The Great Resignation, some of these stats were frightening to me when I looked at them a couple of months ago and put this together, but they're still relevant today. 41% of employees considering changing their jobs. People are having existential crises out there on Zoom. Certainly I've had them myself. Why am I here? What can I do? How can I do more? What's the purpose of it all? Does anyone even care? I'm here in my virtual Zoom land, and I'm not saving lives. And so to the extent we already have that as knowledge workers, maybe to some degree, because we might be 2 or 3 steps removed from the end customer, it becomes even more important now to reconnect people to the purpose of the work that we're doing. Why does it matter? What is it that matters about it? And then what's our personal role? in creating that change that we want to see in the world. And so in April 2021, again, a U.S. Statistic, I apologize, but 4 million people on a base of 160 million people in the workforce quit their jobs. And again, that number was even higher as we went into the third quarter of the year. So this is staggering. Some of this is, of course, churn, people just looking to, if I can't change the world, maybe I can change my job. And so I'll go try something new. But the opportunity here would be, again, to make sure we don't see people exiting fully the workforce, particularly if it sets us back in terms of minority representation and representation of women. And so we have to have a very intentional focus on that. We do not want to step backwards. And so, again, how do we create environments and cultures that people want to be part of? Again, the notion of remote work, looking for a silver lining here as well, is that talent can be tapped from outside of the main centers. And so, even this event that we're on today, it's just heartwarming and really great to see that people can show up from all over the world and are probably more likely to do now that we're comfortable using this format to connect with each other and to share. So before I close, I will say share a couple of strategies around this piece of people and what we can do about it, because again, it does seem somewhat overwhelming that so much is up for grabs. That's a picture of my daughter, by the way, on the Brooklyn side, looking over at Manhattan, but not looking over at Manhattan. She's looking, and I use this visual because she's not looking at what we would expect her to be looking at. She's not looking at the big buildings on the other side. She's looking at her brother and sister that are trying to find them coming down the promenade. And I say that to say, I use that visual because we need to be looking at the people, not the buildings, not the offices, not the physical locations where people work, but rather the actual space that we're creating for people to show up to. We need to focus more on how the work gets done, and where the work gets done is perhaps not so much of a focus. And so again, looking to provide tools that foster collaboration, thinking intentionally about the technology that we use for that, rethinking roles so that they can be performed remotely. How do we break down the work in different ways so that we are able to open up to that talent base that might be remote? And how do we increase agility across and mobility across those roles so people can have different types of careers that are maybe not as linear as they were in the past? We need to rethink the leadership model. I mentioned adaptive leadership. We now have a lot of MBA courses focusing entirely on transformational leadership and adaptive leadership, and thinking about leadership as a philosophy, not necessarily management, but leading. How do we motivate and inspire as opposed to direct and control? How do we create this notion of a learning organization? How do we engender curiosity? And how do we create space for people to grow and take an expansive view of what our roles are as leaders, and building out those skills? We spend a lot of time, I spent a lot of time at EY on culture as a long-term value driver, and we look at leadership, behavioral sciences aspects of leadership and incorporating those. You may have the competency to lead, but do you have the character to lead? And again, these are new words that the corporate world is, new words that we're sort of integrating into the fabric of the corporate landscape. We wouldn't have used words like transcendence and temperament and judgment and ethics and so on in everyday conversation about judgment of leadership and assessing leadership. But now these things become much more important as we move forward here post-pandemic. This is critical, how we measure. What are the systems of measurement that we're using? So I shared with you some productivity stats that would tell you that everything is okay. But actually, when we take a look underneath and we peel back a little, we say, perhaps it isn't. Are we measuring outcomes as opposed to measuring, what the actual things that are getting done? Are we measuring the impact of those things? And so corporates are shifting their measurement systems to outcomes and key results, which really measure from the point of view of the end customer and the end recipients and the person to whom we're trying to create value. Do they see the value? How does that value get measured, and how does it get reciprocated back in the attribution systems to employees? So we're trying to bring everybody in the organization, line them up around what the value is, no matter how far back they sit, if you will, in the corporate chain. We want to make sure that they're connected and that they have a sense of purpose and that they have a sense of how the work is valued and the value that they bring based on the jobs that they do. I use this word orchestrator very intentionally. We're looking to create a new type of knowledge worker, if you will, who is able to orchestrate in the sense of orchestrating technologies. So many of the technologies that we have nowadays, from robotic process automation and other types of technologies, really abstract users from the technology and the coding underneath, and allow them to really create systems by expressing business logic. And so they do get to orchestrate new types of products and flows and workflows, and interconnectivity between different parts of the platform that they can do themselves. It's a self-serve type of environment. So again, this is a new set of skills that we're teaching people how to self-serve in this sort of a technology environment, and how to, again, rethink everything that we're doing with the notion of being more proximate to the end value, to the customer, and to stakeholders more broadly. I mentioned this briefly, and I'll mention it again, is that, again, this notion that we're asking to really create an intentional focus on social capital and the changing social contract. And so a lot of the work that we're doing post-pandemic does relate to ESG. And so again, really looking at what is the place that this organization occupies in the world, who are the set of stakeholders that are impacted by the work that is done, and how do we think about not just giving away the money that we make, but changing the way we make money, and who benefits in that enterprise, and how does that long-term value proposition sort of play out in the way that we're rewarding people, in the way that we're welcoming people into the organization, and in the way that the work gets done. So again, massive transformation happening, I would say, across the entire corporate landscape, accelerated and fueled by the pandemic to some degree, in terms of, needing to speed up, needing to be more expansive in terms of who's at the table and who we're listening to in the conversation about transformation, and then really exercising a different type of dexterity in leadership that becomes much more about being adaptable and being inspirational and motivational and inclusive, as opposed to prescriptive and procedural. I think the notion of management is really transforming, and the types of leadership that we're creating in the world really matters. And I just maybe would end that with what is perhaps my favorite quote about what is leadership, and that is the reciprocal relationship that exists between those who choose to lead and those who choose to follow. And so the idea that it's a choice in there is important, and the idea that it's situational is important, in the sense that it can be very democratic if we think about it that way. Leadership can come from lots of different places, and we need to be open to that. Eddie mentioned at the beginning, it's 28 years ago since I graduated, but I learn every day from the people who come into the organization that work for me and around me, and I learn every day from new graduates. And so, again, thinking about that as we think about how we exit from this pandemic, and we think about what are the silver linings that we've learned, what are the things that really matter in our own leadership agendas. I'll pause there. There's a quick video that I'll share at the end, but I do want to leave some time for Q&A. I know I shared a lot. I came at you with a lot of stats, and I want to make sure that we have the opportunity for folks to participate and welcome any questions that are coming from the floor. So let me pause there, Gillian, and see if you had any coming from the chat or from yourself.
Okay, thank you, Grainne. Yes, just before we get into the Q&A, a warm welcome from the Ulster University Business School. And goodness, what a fascinating presentation there, between some of the stats and some of your insights there. There's a lot I'm sure everybody's taking out of that this afternoon. Grainne, certainly I am. And all I can think from this side is, that this ties in very well to one of the new master's programs within the business school that was developed this year, and that's our master's called Business in Technology. And a lot of those themes that you're covering fit very, very well onto that. So, it's interesting just to see that alignment. Now, I know there's some questions coming into the chat bar. But maybe a first one, and this is from myself at this point. Knowing what you know now and all that you have achieved, what would you suggest in terms of what would be the one thing that you would suggest to new graduates to do to create opportunity and add value within the workplace?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Gillian. And like I said earlier, I think the opportunity for us to learn from new graduates, those of us who have been here for a long time, is tremendous. And so, find your voice would be an obvious one. Meaning, I think sometimes we can, all suffer a little bit from the imposter syndrome that says, "Oh gosh, I don't deserve to be here. Why would anyone want to hear from me? What is it that I can contribute?" And I would say, try to, manage that if you can, eliminate that, make sure you do find a way to insert what it is that you have to offer. And I would say, things are changing so rapidly that everything is up for grabs, and digital natives definitely know more in many cases about some of the technologies that we were talking about and looking at earlier. And so your voice really matters, and we need to hear it. So find a way that's comfortable for you to show up. I will say that it took me a long time in my career to figure out I'm a highly extroverted person, but that has some downsides in the corporate world in terms of how you show up and the space that you occupy. And I learned that I had to temper myself a little bit, both in terms of speed and energy, in order to really make people understand when I had something to say that really mattered. And so again, understanding who you are and how you like to communicate, whether it's an introverted style or an extroverted style, really think through that. What is authentic to your own style? The goal is not to change yourself to be like everybody else in the room. If you've done that, something's wrong. It sometimes feels like that's comfortable to do, but it's not a strategy for long-term success, and it's not the reason why you were hired, even if it's an easier way perhaps to sort of fit in. And there is a tendency to want to fit in before you sort of stand out. But make sure you don't spend too much time not showing up as who you really are, and find a way to express, in a way that's authentic to you, what it is that you need to say in the rooms that you're in. Okay,
that's a great start for us. Okay, a few questions coming in from the audience. We have one from Mark Gannon, and this is around, with automation and AI, how do we prepare organizations and our employees for what will feel like a very different and challenging transition? And I know you touched on that, but what's your key insights on that?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. So I think there's a sort of a practical aspect to it, which is looking at jobs that can be automated and figuring out how best to do that. So the companies have been doing that for a while with robotic process automation and other automative type intelligence process automation type tools. So the candidate list for jobs that should be automated, I would say firms are pretty far down that track. When it comes to then upskilling the workforce and creating sort of digital capability in the workforce, again, that's something that is technical and cultural. And so the technical aspects, of course, would be teaching people what the new technologies are capable of and how they can be used. But I think the more important piece, perhaps, is the cultural transformation that needs to happen here in terms of, again, how do we create this idea of a learning organization? How do we instill that curiosity? How do we reward folks who do take risk in that process? And how do we encourage that in the culture? And so, if you are a person who perhaps isn't at the cusp of emerging technologies or considers that to be, a little bit outside of your wheelhouse, I would say find something here that where you can create value that by learning as quickly as everybody else. So there's so many things that are new around, the technologies themselves, the long-term value propositions, the way that companies are disclosing even information around the ESG agenda. These are all new rules, new requirements, new possibilities, new opportunities. So if you're an employee who's out there who says, hey, I'm thinking about my next gig and I'm thinking about ways that I can differentiate myself going forward, you just have to jump on one of these new things and start learning, because you'll be moving just as quickly as everybody else. The opportunity, nobody's an expert, right? The opportunity for all of us to show up and create an impact is real.
Okay, just leading on from that as well, question in from one of our own team, Nancy Brown. Significant changes, obviously the pressures for organisations to move as quickly as possible. What's your advice on that, creating a culture of learning from failure?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, from Nancy. One of the things that we do a lot of is cultural diagnostics, meaning looking at, is there a disconnect between what management and the strategy that management has and the mission of the organization and the daily lived experiences of people in that organization. And so when we go into companies and we do this work, we look at what are the tenets of culture that people are leaning into right now, and it can vary based on how old is the company, what is it that they're trying to do, what's the competitive environment, et cetera. When we look at what is management think they're leaning into from a cultural perspective, and then we measure what is the employee base really saying about that, what is the lived experience, sometimes we do see that drift. And so that's where I would say we need to start. So if management expresses that the intention of the culture is to embrace innovation and learning, then one of the things we would go examine is, what does the reward system say about failure? Does the reward system at all have positive reinforcement rewards in it? And we often find times it doesn't. It only has negative to the downside. So there's not a balanced scorecard there between sort of the things that you get dinged for in your performance reviews, because compliance is real, and people make mistakes and people have to have disciplinary actions happen to them. But on the flip side, we don't really see commensurate rewards happening for people demonstrating behaviors that the company thinks are critical to the long-term success of the company. And so how do you make sure that the reward system is balanced in that way would be my advice, is that you'd have to look to see, is the employee experience one that would say, yes, I'm rewarded for leaning in and doing the things that the company says that we need to do around innovation.
Okay. Following on from that, question in from Claire Loughlin. Your thoughts about how do you bring the executive team on board in terms of how they need to see beyond the here and now and focus more on future skills and a different mindset?
Yeah, so I think that's why many of our clients do have these programs, and it's great to see even in the university you're changing a little bit, the syllabus and the courses to incorporate what I'll call adaptive leadership. And adaptive leadership sits at the cusp between sort of at the intersection, I would say, of the business and the technology. So perhaps in the past we might have thought of these things as very siloed, it's a technical track or it's a business track. We're now seeing that when we think about agile organizations, these are organizations that are capable of shifting more quickly around the environment and all of the different things that are causing opportunities to arise, whether it's technology, whether it's regulatory, whether it's human oriented. And so a good course on adaptive leadership and the ability to do transformational leadership, which mostly, if you look at these courses, they mostly center around the ability to manage change and the ability to create culture that allows change to flourish, and that can balance the disruptive effect of that with the commercial realities of that.
Okay, again, with one from Jeff Marshall. How does an organization build trust and create transparency?
Yeah, this is an excellent question, and one that the financial services sector has been grappling with since the 2008 crisis, right, with management in the penalty box and regulators fining heavily the industry for bad behavior. It's a great question that all of the regulators around the world are asking, is how do we create more transparency around what's really going on. And so I would say from a policy regulatory perspective, what we're seeing is that the box of disclosure is expanding dramatically. So in other words, we're not just asking firms to disclose what they have done, we're asking them to disclose how they do it. So the regulators are looking at, they're measuring culture. They're measuring around the financial statements. They're asking for disclosures that go way beyond the financial statements. And so they're looking at the behaviors of these firms. So that would be sort of one way that we can tell that measurement is a good way. Transparency equals trust in some cases. So I would say casting a light into some of these areas around the behavioral aspects. The other thing is, of course, some of these more modern technologies really help us bring that transparency and shed light onto some of the data that's out there. So we can create insights, we can create telemetry that looks at things in a different way. And somebody asked a question about bias as well in artificial intelligence and so on. So the measurement systems have to keep pace with the underlying technologies in order to be effective. And so oftentimes the regulators are trailing a little bit, and so sort of, the horse already bolted before the regulators sort of catch up and find out. I will share with you one quick thing that's happening that should give people comfort around this. And so we have large practices at all the big four firms in forensics, and what those practices do is they sort of come in after a lawsuit has happened, or public censure has happened, and they piece together the fact pattern of what happened and look for evidence inside the company, right, to support either the defensible position or to support the claim. And so those are now becoming predictive, or the forensics teams engage typically post-fact. Now they're building technology to be able to listen, to become continuous listening organizations looking for potential breaches before they even happen. So they're leveraging large data analytics, they're leveraging heuristics from things they know that have already gone wrong, and they're leveraging future scenario planning, where they look into the future and they look at emerging risks and themes, and they examine for behaviors that could contribute to the downside element of those risks too, and they're thinking differently about how to manage those risks, both in terms of the behaviors, but also the impact on long-term value of the organization. How do they hedge those risks that are just emerging? And so, the dramatic power of technology to aid us here, but there is, this sort of conscience that needs to be there from the point of view of both the people who are regulating it and the people whose hands the technology is in, that are creating things that, we need them to do good in the world. And so somebody needs to be watching.
Okay, plenty of questions, but I'll take one more. This is from Crystal Miller within the Business School. With increased trends in remote working, this offers firms the opportunities to develop expert teams from across the globe. Do you feel that fully remote or virtual teams can be effective? And if so, what tools or good practices would you encourage teams to be using?
Yeah, that's also a great question. Can it be effective long run, right? Are there certain things that can only happen in a synchronous manner? So we spent some time looking at, again, the breakdown of the work. So you have to look at what things really need to happen synchronously, meaning we need to be participating together to do that, and we need real-time feedback, versus they can happen asynchronously because we have the technology to do so. So we can contribute later. Sometime later I can look at the document and I can, contribute my remarks, or I can, add my impact in a different way. So looking at the breakdown of the work itself is a part of that. But I would also say, again, the culture of how we interact with each other in these virtual rooms and how we set up the hybrid environment. So, I've seen different strategies. We've used different strategies to welcome people in who are not in the physical room if they're in the virtual room. So allocating captains, we've done this in workshops where we've called people ahead of time who would be in the remote room and said, hey, we really need to make sure we hear from you. We need you to lean in around these areas. I want to make sure that we give you the opportunity to do so, but I also need you to, shout out if we don't, because the room gets chatty and busy and noisy, and it can be hard to participate from the virtual environment. So how do you create norms that welcome people in and make sure that there is a space for people to contribute, even if they're not in the physical room, that the conversation is not dominated by those that are in the physical room. And of course, there are a lot of technology glitches with, just the ability to hear everybody in the room if you're on the virtual, and things like that we're all working through. And I know Microsoft is working through, various iterations of their technology to help us with that. But again, I would say an intentional focus on the breakdown of the work itself, and then the cultural norms that need to get revisited to make sure that we're being as inclusive as we can possibly be.
Okay, thank you, Grainne. Really fascinating talk this afternoon. So at this point, I'll hand you over to the Executive Dean of the Business School, Professor Mark Durgan.
Thanks, Gillian. Grainne, thank you so much. Such a stimulating talk. It falls to me to try and summarize some of the key takeaways, which I don't think I'm going to be able to do, given just the scale of what you have spoken about. But some of the things that came through very strongly there were the fact, obviously, we're living in a very increasingly digitized context, which, it's impacting the work we do, but also it's impacting how we do that work. And I think that interface that you talked about between humans, innovation and technology, where value is created, I think is a hugely important takeaway for people to think about. Indeed, when you think about the graduates and younger people who might be on this call, thinking about how to future-proof themselves in this current time of disruption, it seemed to me your focus on humanity and the role of the human is so important in that, because the skills that can't be replicated or automated are those skills around empathy and emotional intelligence and communication and creativity. So, very important to have the tech fluency, but also very important to have those human skills developed, and the interface between those, I think, is so important. I loved your reference, and it reminded me of a recent podcast on the Hive, talking about this remote working and the loss of the incidental conversations, those water cooler moments that you talked about. And you said, you had a lovely line where you said, we need to reconnect people to their work. And it seemed to me you were suggesting that humanity was really the bridge through which we did that. And I think that's a very important aspect as well. Your focus on innovation, I really liked. And certainly in the business school, what we try and do is preface innovation with a concentration on creativity and creative thinking so that we can stimulate the innovation. And then, as you talked about, monetizing that innovation and bringing it to market, our focus on entrepreneurial effort and endeavor to try and have graduates thinking and students thinking about how to create and transform opportunity into new value is really central to how we bring that innovation to market in an effective way. So having graduates that can think and do and aren't being defined by the context are actually able to work through the context and have the intellectual and the practical skills to navigate their way through that uncertainty and find value, I think it's hugely important. And as you were talking and I was reflecting on our slightly common backgrounds by way of coming from banking, I was reminded, Grainne, of some research dating back, believe it or not, to 1978. A researcher called Chase talked about the advent of technology coming into financial services. This was really in relation to ATMs, right? So it's really small technological innovations at that time. But he talked about technology coming into retail banking and saying that irrespective of what technology brings us by way of automation, the differential is always going to lie in your people. And that kind of just came full circle for me as you were talking, because I think that's such an important lesson for us. So thank you so much for bringing out the role of the human at that interface between technology and innovation, and also the future of work. I think that's hugely important. And to close up really and just say to you, thank you so much for your time and for the effort you've made by way of preparation and coming to us today to share your thinking. We were delighted to gain from your expertise and your perspectives. I want to thank those staff at the alumni office as well, Eddie, Roisin, Leanne in the business engagement unit, and Gillian's team. And also a special thanks to those 90, 100 people I could see moving around in the attendance for making the time to come along and listen and joining us today. Particularly of note, I think, was the comment Eddie made at the start, which was just the corners of the globe from which our audience have come today, and that's testimony to you, Grainne, and the important message that you have given us. We run, of course, these events fairly regularly with the alumni office, and they have proven to be very popular and an excellent platform for engaging in connecting and networking within the wider alumni community. And I would commend to you uuconnects.com, which is the forum through which you can connect with us and with each other. And I think that's a fantastic platform through which to maintain and build your network. Of course, you are all thinking about ways of future-proofing yourselves and your companies at the moment. And it's not just a seasonal thing where you might be doing that in January at the start of the year. Now it's an all-round thing of constantly thinking about how you can add value to your company and how your company can add value to you. Please do consider the range of options that we have in terms of our program portfolio to help you with your growth and with your development. And if you wish to get in touch with any questions around the programs that we offer, engage@ulster.ac.uk is the fastest way to do that. So I want to thank the audience. I want to thank the Ulster team But in particular, Grainne, hopefully you'll still consider yourself to be part of the Ulster team, even though it's a long way from Donegal and Coleraine and European business studies. But listen, thank you so much for your wisdom, for your perspective, for your kindness, for your humanity, and for just sharing with us your perspectives today. It's extremely appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. My pleasure. Thank you so much.